A little video clip with a gentleman talking to Forces News. Now, these are reports that come out to British Armed Forces troops, the Army, Navy, Air Force, apparently giving them factual information on Ukraine. Let's have a look at this little clip and see what the gentleman concerned says.
The logic would seem to be that they're trying to take the Donetsk region, but you know, they're not exactly choosing the best places to attack. And my suspicion is that Putin has given them a directive. You do this, and then everybody then follows the directive without you know, rhyme or reason or just cause. They're just bombarding everything. They're just shelling everything. They're shelling the city and they're shelling the surrounding area to Bakhmut. World War I trench works are there, but of course also the guys have got to defend the city area as well, which is actually, you know, which is quite challenging because it's quite a big place. So it's not a small amount of people that are in there defending. So yes, in places, you know, it's World War I trench works where the forests are, the forests around Bakhmut and the parks and things, they're just no longer there like that. You know, the trees are shredded. So that is World War I looking at it. It's rotten. It's horrible there. This is the post-Putin struggle actually starting already. So, you know, the boss of Wagner Group wants to show everybody that the army's useless and his people are powerful, so that he is an important person in the post-Putin world.
So an interesting little dialogue. What does he get into? Effectively, he gets into regime change. But the key question is, who is Lieutenant Colonel Glen Grant? Before I answer that question, Alex, what did you make of I know that was only a few seconds of delivery, but what did you make of the statements by that man?
How can we put this? Lieutenant Colonel Grant has got a slick manner about him. I'm not suggesting he's a particularly, you know, mendacious operator, but the talking points have clearly come out of quite some reflection, and they're well coordinated with the footage. Those listening in audio only might have missed that there was a few seconds of Russian prisoners being addressed by the Wagner Group, this private military company, and being told, and there is plenty of other footage of this, we are going to offer you prisoners a chance to fight in Ukraine. And of course that supports the case of Russian desperation that's being made. It is one of the aspects at stake, and there is genuine footage of that, of prisoners being told, look, you can fight in Ukraine, and if you don't like it, we'll just execute you. I know that sounds particularly shocking to some people, but that is one of the things going on. It's not the whole picture. So he's presenting it perhaps, shall we say, in tandem with those who are making the report. It's obvious that they want to lead the questions in a certain direction towards the idea of total Russian desperation, and perhaps ignoring the idea of the operational level of warfare, in which commanders, as in the Second World War on the Eastern Front, were told this is your objective and you're largely free to achieve it with your resources.
Okay, thank you for that, Alex. Very interesting. You used the description slick. Well, I think this man is slick, and he's slick because he's not quite what he seems. So what label can we put on him? Well, let's bring in this straight away. A senior fellow of the Institute for Statecraft. And he mentioned, or it was on screen, he was a defence expert, the Baltic Security Foundation. Well, if you've never heard of that before, go and have a look at their website. It's a group of people that have come together in order to sort out Baltic strategic security with a foundation and a project. And Patrick, I'm going to say to you, can't really find out any easy detail about how this group's funded, but I don't get a warm feeling about it. This to me is deep state, almost certainly UK and the US working with others. What are your thoughts?
Oh, just one of many of a collection of a rainbow of various think tanks and organizations, which are mainly to keep certain people employed after their careers in civil service or in the military, or to prep them for media appearances and media segments, and to basically circulate talking points. Think tanks are basically the government or the deep state's version of academia. These are people who wouldn't be in academia, so they create their own academic institutions through networks of think tanks in order to promulgate ideas, and that's of course funded by either the state or by the defense industry.
Yeah, so unlikely to be independent in what it's doing and the viewpoint that it's putting across. Well, let's put up a bit more information on former Lieutenant Colonel Glen Grant. Here's some information which you can find on the Baltic Security Foundation. So he worked as a defence and reform expert in Ukraine. He's worked for the Ukrainian Institute for the Future, Sandhurst, the Royal Naval College at Greenwich. He's worked in Latvia, Estonia, Bulgaria, Macedonia, Montenegro, Moldova, Poland, Albania, Kosovo, Slovenia. So this is a 37-year course, but this man is highly politically involved. Let's just flag up some key points. So he was formerly working with the Ukraine Institute for the Future, Senior Fellow for the Institute of Statecraft, Reformer of the Ukrainian Defence Housing. Now that sounds a simple thing, but actually there seems to be quite a lot of it. He's also been a reformer of the Ukrainian military, and he is rabidly anti-Russian. This comes across in his statements and his written work. He seems to really dislike the Russians. And he's also claimed to be founder member of the SCP political party in Latvia. And I'll just throw this one at you, Alex. I found it fascinating that this man has been cruising around the eastern states, and then he can simply decide he's going to reside in a country and start a political party. This to me does not sound possible for somebody who is simply a former army officer.
It's utterly not done in Sandhurst circles and Warminster circles where he's from, but in his adopted home of Riga, where he now lives there, and in all of those former Soviet and Soviet satellite states, it is quite normal for a military big man to found a party. Riga, of course, has been suggested by several people as the home of the Juan Guaido-style Russian government in exile, the pro-Western government in waiting. Far be it from me to suggest that there's a concrete role there for Lieutenant Colonel Grant, but if there were such plans, he would be one of the main men setting it up. And for those who are wondering about what I was saying a moment ago about the Wagner Group not being squeaky clean, there is plenty of footage. Look for Yevgeniy Prigozhin, the commander of it, clearly a very unsavory character running the Wagner Group, and I think that's should we say Lieutenant Colonel Grant's nemesis in here. The two of them are, maybe making accusations at each other. Grant is suggesting that Prigozhin is in the running to mount a palace coup against Putin, which is a common talking point, not very credible to me. But there you go. No, it's quite a hot cauldron that's brewing around Lieutenant Colonel Grant's claims here. But he, as you say, he's gone right down from the Baltic to the Black Sea, turning ministries of defense against the Russians, and he's been in Chile as well.
Okay, thank you for that. Well, let's just remind our viewers of the really excellent work that Mike Robinson in particular did with the Integrity Initiative and a look into the deep state. So I picked up immediately that our Lieutenant Colonel Grant had been a fellow there with another deep state organisation. And if you haven't seen any of these articles, which are up on the UK Column website, please do read them to get an understanding of what we're seeing here. And the Integrity Initiative, a look into the deep state here, and the Institute of Statecraft, these are where you should start off. But the whole thing gets deeper, because here is that report into poor governance and corruption in Ukraine's defence housing system. It's not simply there weren't houses, the problem is institutional corruption, and it's identified as being a massive problem. So although this was a few years ago, much of it has still not been cleared from Ukraine, and we're seeing reports of that, particularly around Odessa, which has been covered on the UK Column in the last few days. We've got here on the UK government's website, call for project proposals to support defence reforms in Ukraine. So all this is still going on. But of course, what are we talking about here in 2019? We're after people to help ramp up Ukraine's defence industry. And they're talking about one particular company here, UkrOboronProm. And what is this? Well, it's a vast defence manufacturer. So now we know that the British government embedding itself in this organisation in order to modernise it, in order to ramp up production for the war, which clearly the government knew was coming, the UK government knew was coming. Are we talking therefore about a war between Ukraine and Russia, or is it between the UK and NATO and Russia? I think it's the latter. You can visit this company's website and see that they're talking about the sheer scale of the company. So, Patrick, this is just so obvious, the deep state meddling of the UK and the US in order to foment this war. And of course, Merkel has now admitted that the Minsk agreements were cynically used in order to buy time, in order to get Ukraine as a proper military force to attempt what? Regime change against the Russians.
No, absolutely. What this also shows is that Ukraine has zero sovereignty as a country. Their cabinet, their leadership's handpicked by the U.S. State Department. Their defense is being run by NATO, being run by the UK, being run by the United States. So it's like on the sovereignty index, you've heard of the corruption index, right? The global corruption index. On the global sovereignty index, Ukraine is also right down there at the bottom, instead of being like they were at the top of the corruption index. So that's just not good news for the people of Ukraine. If you care about the country itself, if this keeps going, Brian, there's not going to be much of a country left.
No, and I think that the likes of Ben Wallace and Boris Johnson will be delighted because they are in the background planning this. Well, let's just come back to Lieutenant Colonel Glen Grant. And we talked about the Ukraine Institute for the Future. So we're just going to pop that on screen. So the Institute is, of course, an independent think tank. That's remarkable, isn't it? When we think about what he has been engaged with, this claims to be an independent think tank which forecasts changes and designs possible scenarios in Ukraine. Is this helping to foment the war? I would be highly suspicious that it might be. And if we look at other people involved, we've got Viktor Andrusev here. And of course, what do you see when you look at what his skills are? Social activism and change. So we're drilling into the organizations which have been seeded in Ukraine, and it's all about changing society, activism, change, transformation, disruption. A little bit more here. We've got what I've called a premonition, the report which they're talking about back in March 2020. How can Ukraine prepare for the crisis? Well, we're to believe from this article that they were simply looking at an economic crisis, but I think the image that they've chosen gives us a good idea that what was coming was pretty dark. And it goes on. We can't dwell on it too long in today's news, but as we go through Ukraine, we can see it's now riddled with organizations. Here we've got the Ukraine Democracy Initiative. If we animate the screen a little bit, you'll see how the images come up, engaging with the most active and game-changing pro-democracy groups in Ukraine. Trust us. Let us inject Western democracy into Ukraine and you'll be safe. But of course, they admit there that it's part of a global network. And we can get into other areas. So we've got project goals. I found this interesting because a donor here is the International Renaissance Foundation. And if we have a look at the International Renaissance Foundation, it leads us very quickly through to the famous George Soros. So what are we looking at here? Alex, just very quickly for you, I'm very sure that what we're looking at here is disruption and change agents which have now been injected by the UK and of course the US in particular in order to take over Ukrainian society. This country is being wrecked from the inside, never mind the attacks and the warfare going on with Russia at the moment?
It is being attacked from the inside, and one of the techniques being used from London, both from Spook World and from Think Tank World, is using allied nations, particularly the rabidly anti-Russian chiefs of Latvia and neighbouring Lithuania, as allies, as stuffed shirts, really. Don't forget that recently Kit Klarenberg in the Grey Zone reported on the Kerch Strait Bridge blowing up plans that were sent around by Institute for Statecraft people, and one of the key men there, in fact, if memory serves, he was the head of the Ukrainian cluster for the Integrity Initiative some years ago, is Lithuania's first post-independence defense minister, Audrius Butkevičius, who was a key recipient of this plan and stayed around, turning Ukrainian special forces and planners into hotheads for social change. And he came straight out of the late anti-communist scene in Lithuania. So the Brits are very good, very well versed in turning people in the Baltic region into change agents for Ukraine. There's a lot of interchange between the client states of Anglo-American statecraft in that region, and the Ukrainians are sitting ducks and easy targets for such narrative spinning. They can hardly believe that people in fraternal nations would have pro-deep state Western intent.
And I might add, Alex, it's interesting how the Baltic states are now being used, much like the Balkan region has been used for centuries as a buffer zone between two great powers. And the person who's going to lose in the end, if things are to escalate, are going to be those people living in the Baltic regions and people living in Poland. But it's interesting how that buffer zone has shifted north from the old Styrian Empire, Austro-Hungarian Empire, and then north now, the Baltics. Isn't it the same game, Alex?
It very much is that, and there's many links between the Baltic, the Black Sea, and the Adriatic regions, the 3 Seas initiative, the Intermarium plan. We've talked about it in longer format. But we don't have to just make this up ourselves. It's clear that some of the deep state aligned media is talking about the Balkans as a second front, a second Eastern Front. The Baltics would be a third Eastern Front. In population and economic terms, they are much less important than the Balkans, the Ukraine, or the Caucasus. Perhaps they're being kept in reserve in military frontline terms, but they're certainly at the front line of the mind war that's going on between the Russian former satellite countries, or in those countries between Russian and deep state Western interests.
Yeah, thank you, Alex. Well, we'll drop another one on screen so that people can see the scale of this attack on the minds of people in Ukraine. Here we've got the Ukraine Democracy Initiative. We speak, we envision, we enact democracy for Ukraine. And don't worry, because this is a robust, non-partisan and grassroots initiative founded by a group of experienced scholars and civic activists from Australia, Ukraine and abroad. I wonder whether there's a bit of Commonwealth influence here, but it isn't only about Ukraine or even Australia, because it says later in the description that the heart of the initiative is a dedicated global network of academics, field experts, civic activists and pro-democracy groups, policymakers and citizens concerned with the future of democracy. So this is global, it's non-partisan. We need to do more work to see who's funding this one, Patrick. But of course, this attack on Ukraine is also an attack which is being enacted on other Western countries, such as UK here, and even the US of A itself. What more can we say? Well, I just wanted to bring in this quote here, if we pop that back on screen, because this organisation says that Ukraine is the new political testing ground. So it's a testing ground for NATO, UK, US weapons, but also it's a testing ground for how the West can manipulate and control the Ukrainian public mind, which is particularly sad. I'm just going to break the heaviness of this part of the report by putting up a little cartoon clip which has been circulating on social media, but I think it says a lot in a very short space of time. Let's have a look.
Standing behind me are dozens of plaintiffs. Up there, don't jump. or dozens of plaintiffs.
Well, there we had it. Biden was doing one of his, we can't really say what was in his mind as he was talking about or telling people not to jump. But of course, behind him, Zelensky, now the utterly controlled puppet, jumping as much as possible.
I'm going to call fake news on that one, Brian. That can't have been Zelensky, of course, because he wasn't wearing the pea green Benetton T-shirt. So that had to have been edited. I don't think that's an authentic video, Brian.
I take the hit on that one, Patrick. Thank you very much for that. And this one, I think we should have another little video clip here. We're simply going to say, and of course the Western claims that Western weapon systems are going to solve the conflict, are going to win the war. A little bit of tragic footage of the famous F-35B. Let's have a look.
Oh, he just crashed. Oh, shit. Oh, shit.
Well, the tragedy of that little clip, of course, is not just the crash itself, is the fact that the pilot ejected from ground level and that chute seemed to just deploy. So I don't know what the result is, but I hope that the pilot has survived that unfortunate incident. Alex, let's bring you in here because, of course, many people are questioning what the objective of both sides in the Ukraine-Russia conflict. And I think you've got an article that's recently appeared on the UK column website.
We have indeed. Ian Davis, I think it's well known to our regular viewers now, takes, well, I think we're all even-handed, but he takes a more sceptical towards both blocs position than some of us. And there's perfectly sufficient room in UK column analytically to discuss that. So Ian is taking a position that will not be popular here with many of our viewers, but it is well argued. And he's asking here in part one of a two-parter, who wants a multipolar world order, a phrase that most latterly has been spoken about by President Putin at the annual Valdai Speaking Club, a Russian think tank of importance. Here's just one of the things towards the end of the first part of the article that Ian says. With the prospect hanging low of effective global and monetary financial policy control over every nation on earth, it won't matter to the Bank for International Settlements and its central bank members what individual nations imagine their sovereignty to mean. He's being, I think, justly cynical here and arguing that there is a long backstory to the idea that the West could foment or foster or take advantage of trends towards a multipolar world so that it no longer has directly, which is increasingly unmanageable for it financially and culturally, no longer has directly to manage the whole world. It will just give certain fiefdoms away. And I know that this is a position not everyone is happy with. Patrick, I think, to some extent entertains this. Vanessa would be less keen on it, but we are going to continue to ask our viewers and listeners to think hard about these things, because Ian is bringing out a wealth of material pleading for the notion that really the blocs are playing for everything here. In fact, that's a term that Ian uses. It's a game for everything. I don't know whether Patrick has a thought on that, because I'm not suggesting a change in editorial policy, but we are giving Ian scope to discuss this openly.
Well, I personally don't have an editorial policy on this issue. I just look at it as objectively as I can. So, and if you study international relations, people tend to fall in different schools on that. The realist school, for instance, or the liberal internationalist school. But there's other ways, of course, of analyzing this as well. So, in terms of great power politics, and a lot of people want to frame the Great Reset in terms of this Manichaean division between the people and Klaus Schwab and the elites, and the Russians are in bed with Klaus Schwab, and the Chinese are in bed with the World Economic Forum. And so a lot of people want to sort of envision how all these various teams stack up against each other. However, I think you can maybe take even a further step back from all that and look at this in terms of a long-range view of world history. And one of the X factors, of course, throughout world history has been two things: energy and technology. And as these two things develop and progress and resources become more scarce and also become more abundant at the same time because of new technologies and things like that, that will all ultimately, I think, shape things like sovereignty, things like international relations and nation states. So it's a very complex topic, Alex, to be sure. And so certainly, yeah, there's room for lots of different ways of looking at this and a lot of different discussions to be had.
Yeah, okay, thank you for that. So where are you going to take us, Alex, now?